Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes: police were alerted just last month about Maine shooter's threats. We couldn't locate him. Republican presidential candidates profess strong support for Israel as war enters new phase. Mike Pence drops out of 2024 presidential race. This is not my time. The U.S.'s massive debt pile is fueling the bond market crash. These four charts tell the story. Gun violence prevention groups call on Congress to act after Maine mass shooting. Police were alerted just last month about Maine shooter's threats. We couldn't locate him. Associated Press. U.S. Army reservist Robert Card, who killed 2 people and injured 5 in a spate of shootings in the U.S. state of Maine in October, had been reported to police in September after he made veiled threats against his base and fellow soldiers, with police conducting an unsuccessful search for him and adding extra patrols. The FBI confirmed that Card was not on its radar, and that its background check system had no information that would have prohibited Card from purchasing firearms. The case has led to questions about what could have been done to prevent the shootings, including whether Maine's yellow flag law, which allows police to petition a judge to take a person's firearms if a medical practitioner deems them to be a threat, should have been used. Republican presidential candidates profess strong support for Israel as war enters new phase. Yahoo! Republican presidential candidates declared their strong support for Israel on Saturday during a campaign stop that coincided with Israel's stepped-up offensive in the war against Hamas. Former Vice President Mike Pence used his last speech as a candidate to emphasize his traditional Republican views of a robust U.S. foreign policy. He called on Democratic President Joe Biden to unconditionally support Israel's incursion into Gaza. U.S. Senator Tim Scott, Republican South Carolina, and biotech entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy criticized Democratic officials and liberals for what they saw as a failure to sufficiently condemn anti-Semitism across the United States. Mike Pence drops out of 2024 presidential race. This is not my time. Yahoo! Former Vice President Mike Pence dropped out of the 2024 Republican presidential race on Saturday, saying the past 6 months have shown him that his bid is not likely to succeed. Pence, who was Donald Trump's vice president, struggled with fundraising and in polls throughout his campaign. He would have had trouble qualifying for the third Republican debate on November 8 in Miami. The U.S.'s massive debt pile is fueling the bond market crash. These four charts tell the story. Yahoo! The U.S. spiraling national debt is a growing cause of concern for investors as the country's debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 100% and continues to climb. The country's debt has increased from $300 billion in June 1946 to $33 trillion in September 2023, dwarfing the size of the Chinese, Japanese, German, Indian and British economies. The U.S. is one of just 21 countries where the size of the deficit exceeds total GDP. The ballooning debt burden is affecting markets, with prices of Treasury bonds collapsing. Gun violence prevention groups call on Congress to act after Maine mass shooting. Yahoo! Gun violence prevention groups are calling for Congress to act following the latest mass shooting that left 18 people dead and several others injured in Lewiston, Maine earlier this week. Our laws as written. There is no community and nobody in any community that can feel safe from gun violence, Christian Hain, Chief Policy and Programs Officer at Brady United Against Gun Violence, told the GRIO. We do very little to prevent incidents like ours from happening. I think until we ask more of our elected leaders, we can expect that they'll continue to happen and nobody's safe. Yasmin Fletcher Braithwaite, Deputy Director for Federal Policy at Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, noted that Congress made some progress when President Joe Biden signed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. The law is the first significant piece of gun safety legislation in 3 decades, she said. They're currently working to implement that law, Braithwaite said. But there's more that Congress can be doing. Hamas's attack on Israel has changed the Middle East. Al Jazeera opinion. The recent attack by Hamas on Israeli military installations and settlements has had far-reaching consequences for the Middle East. The attack caught Israel by surprise and led to the deaths of around 1,400 Israelis. In response, Israel launched a war on Gaza, imposing a blockade and bombing civilian buildings. The conflict has changed the dynamics of the region and has put the U.S. strategy of de-escalation in shambles. The U.S. had been trying to limit its involvement in the Middle East and focus on China, but the attack has put an end to these plans. The normalization process between Israel and Saudi Arabia has been frozen, and the U.S. has increased its military presence in the region. The U.S.'s efforts to de-escalate tensions with Iran have also come to an end. Arab governments are facing pressure to take action in solidarity with the Palestinians, which could go against U.S. wishes. Iran is also in a difficult position, as it supports Hamas, but does not want to be dragged into a direct confrontation with Israel or the U.S. The involvement of the U.S. in another conflict in the Middle East would be welcomed by Russia and China, as it would divert resources away from their own regions. Dean Phillips's challenge to Biden makes Democrats ask if 80 is too old. Washington Post. Representative Dean Phillips, Democrat, Minnesota, has announced his candidacy challenging President Biden for the Democratic presidential nomination. Phillips, who was elected to Congress in 2018, wants Biden to step aside for a younger generation. He is open about his concerns that Biden might not be the strongest Democrat to go into a general election contest against former President Donald Trump, 77, or against a younger and fresher candidate. However, Biden remains the almost certain nominee for the Democrats. California Governor Gavin Newsom is also putting himself in a position to run, should something happen to Biden. He recently met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Senator Joe Manchin III, Democrat, West Virginia, flirts with no labels and a third-party candidacy. National polls show a different contest for 2024. Biden is by most measures in a toss-up race with Trump. For whatever reasons, be it that the polls are more accurately stating Trump's support, or that voters have their own qualms about the president, Biden appears to be in a battle that looks more challenging than in 2020, despite Trump's obvious weaknesses. Vodafone nears stake sale in €5 billion Spanish unit to Zegona, sources say. Yahoo! Vodafone is expected to sell at least 50% of its Spanish business to Zegona Communication in a deal valuing the asset at over €5 billion, $5.3 billion, according to sources. Zegona, a London-based acquisition vehicle, beat other bidders, including private equity firm RRJ Capital, to acquire the stake in Vodafone's business, though the deal could still be delayed or abandoned, sources added. The deal would be Vodafone's first step in its strategy to exit non-core European markets. Political danger for Biden receding as second automaker has deal with UAW. Politico. Stellantis has reached a tentative agreement with the United Auto Workers, UAW, according to unnamed sources, following negotiations that lasted several days. The deal with the union closely follows a similar accord reached by UAW with Ford, bringing the two companies a step closer to ending the 6-week disruption to the automotive industry caused by the strikes. General Motors is now the only Detroit automaker still negotiating with UAW, and is under pressure to reach an agreement as its competitors' workers return to their jobs. Inside the desperate lobbying effort to push the U.S. to save Hamas hostages. Yahoo! A few days after Israeli soldiers knocked on his door near Tel Aviv to tell him that his son had been captured by Hamas, Rubichin hopped on a plane to New York. He's been patiently retelling his story ever since, outside the United Nations Tuesday, in all-day meetings with members of Congress from both parties Thursday, to Vice President Kamala Harris on Friday. Biden's steadfast support of Israel puts his election campaign and foreign policy making through one of its most difficult tests. The Globe and Mail. U.S. President Joe Biden has shifted his policy towards Israel as a result of rising pressure from within his own party, including Arab American legislators, left-wing activists, and younger voters. Biden initially provided forceful backing to Israel's right to self-defense, but has since pushed for humanitarian aid to be sent to Gaza and suggested a humanitarian pause in Israel's bombardment of the region. However, Biden has continued to offer his support to Israel's war effort, rushing ammunition to the country and requesting that Congress authorize further military aid. His administration has argued that a ceasefire would only benefit Hamas. Biden's foreign policy making and political acumen face a significant test as Israel expands its ground invasion, and with a presidential election approaching in a year. Wael al-Zayat, the head of MJIJ, a Muslim American organization that runs voter turnout drives, said that Arab American communities in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Virginia could swing a tight election, with their lack of support for Biden potentially benefiting Donald Trump. Ukraine initiates security guarantee consultations with Netherlands. Yahoo! Ukraine has begun talks with the Netherlands on bilateral security guarantees. The move comes after Ukraine previously initiated discussions with the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and France on the same issue. During the talks, the two sides discussed cooperation in the military sphere, economic recovery, sanctions against Russia, and the use of confiscated Russian assets. They also discussed the establishment of defense production in Ukraine, and Dutch support for Ukraine's path to the European Union and NATO. The talks took place on the sidelines of the third meeting on the Ukrainian peace formula, which is being held in Malta. Dutch Premier Rutte says he is open to becoming next NATO chief. Yahoo! Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte has said he is open to becoming the next Secretary General of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Rutte, who will retire from politics after the November 22 elections, said the role would be very interesting, and that he could still contribute something. He said he did not plan to campaign for the position, but would accept it if it came his way. Rutte said there was a very big chance he may not get the role, as there is broad support for a female European official to replace the current Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg. Biden's Israel ties rooted in long career, from his gut to his heart to his head. New York Times. This article discusses the long-standing support for Israel demonstrated by U.S. President Joe Biden. The author notes that Biden's support for Israel goes beyond scripted talking points, and is deeply personal to him. He has been a staunch supporter of Israel for over half a century, with his views on the country shaped by family conversations about the Holocaust and stories from a survivor of the death camps. Some believe that Biden's Irish heritage and his own personal tragedies make him empathize with historically marginalized people and those who have suffered loss. New Speaker Mike Johnson holds favor with conservatives. Can he unite the GOP where others failed? The Toronto Star. The new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, is trying to unite the Republican Party, which has been divided for years. Johnson, a Louisiana Republican, emerged last week from the lower ranks of the House GOP leadership to ascend to Speaker after lawmakers, driven by a faction of hardliners, ousted Representative Kevin McCarthy from the job, and then rejected two more top-ranked Republicans in leadership as well as conservative favorite Representative Jim Jordan. Johnson is not a member of the hard-charging House Freedom Caucus. He is seen by Republicans as a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, unlike previous speakers such as McCarthy, Republican California, or former Representative John Boehner, Republican Ohio. Johnson has a lot more credibility with conservatives than McCarthy did. But Johnson faces the same questions that McCarthy faced: how to patch together a slim Republican majority racked by feuding, how to keep the government funded and open for business. Does Congress provide more wartime aid for Ukraine? McCarthy had years of experience in leadership to help deal with such challenges. In the end, though, he could not unite Republicans. What we're learning about House Speaker Mike Johnson and his demands for government funding. CNN. Mike Johnson, the new Republican House Speaker, has outlined his worldview in a recent interview with Fox News. Johnson plans to negotiate with the White House about funding bills, but emphasized that Republican support won't come cheap when it comes to funding the government. Johnson mentioned that he wants conditions that the American people can live with, such as budget cuts, and insisted on cuts to fund the government when funding lapses in less than 3 weeks. Johnson also wants to cut the budget in exchange for aid to Israel, and insists Congress should weigh in on military use. In addition, Johnson said the problem is not guns but the human heart as the cause for mass shootings. Although Johnson respects President Joe Biden, he agrees with Hannity that Biden's mental acuity has declined in recent years. Johnson has outlined his core principles as individual freedom, limited government, the rule of law, peace through strength, fiscal responsibility, free markets, and human dignity. He has also defended his beliefs against LGBTQ Americans, and said that culture war issues are not frontline matters. Johnson insists that if people give him a chance, they will see what he's really about. Is crypto financing terrorism? New York Times. The U.S. will target cryptocurrency firms that allow terrorist groups to move money, according to the U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary, Wally Adeyemo. Adeyemo's comments follow a letter by Senator Elizabeth Warren and other members of Congress calling for the Biden administration to crack down on the use of cryptocurrency by terrorists. The comments have sparked a debate over how much cryptocurrency is contributing to terrorism. Some experts argue that crypto is a problem, but not the main source of funding for terrorist groups, with state actors and business portfolios being the main drivers. Cryptocurrency's anonymous nature and intermediaries operating in regulatory gray spaces have long raised concerns that it could be used for terrorist fundraising. However, some aspects of crypto may limit its use by terrorists. The open digital ledgers where crypto transactions are recorded can be traced, and Hamas's armed wing recently announced it would stop Bitcoin fundraising because the activity was being tracked and donors exposed. Members of Congress are calling for more enforcement and legislation, and the Financial Action Task Force has a regulatory framework for crypto, although many countries have not fully applied it. AP, Biden, Xi agree on meeting next month. Yahoo! U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping have agreed in principle to meet at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation (APEC) summit in November, according to an unnamed U.S. official cited by the Associated Press. The official stated that details on the date and location of the meeting are yet to be finalized. No official confirmation has been made by either government regarding Xi's attendance at the summit. Faced with abortion bans, doctors beg hospitals for help with key decisions. Washington Post. Medical professionals in the U.S. are being left at great personal risk when making life-or-death decisions surrounding abortions. State laws surrounding abortion have been ambiguous, with many using vague language, leading to confusion over which cases are deemed a medical emergency and therefore permissible. As a result, doctors have repeatedly sought guidance on how to interpret the exceptions to the laws, and have been given directives from hospital officials that are just as vague as the laws themselves. In some circumstances, doctors have been unable to reach administrators when faced with an emergency situation due to the lack of guidance on how to interpret the law. Meanwhile, hospitals are caught between the contradictory demands of state abortion bans and the Biden administration's use of the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, which requires hospitals to treat emergency medical conditions. Many hospitals have opted for a narrow interpretation of their state's abortion law and fear retribution from anti-abortion lawmakers if they interpret the law more broadly. The future of abortion law is uncertain, with the Biden administration arguing that the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act takes precedence over state abortion bans, while federal judges, appointed by Trump, have argued the opposite. Hospitals fear losing funding if they are found to violate either law. Biden is still living in the 1990s. Telegraph. The U.S. is currently providing military support to both Israel and Ukraine, but there are concerns that it may have to prioritize one conflict over the other. President Joe Biden has emphasized the importance of upholding the rules-based international order and holding those who violate the rules accountable. However, the reality of international relations is that states act in their own self-interest and will use force to achieve their objectives if the benefits outweigh the costs. Biden's assumption that ideology, rather than interests, drives the behavior of America's adversaries and competitors is flawed. It is important for policymakers to have an accurate understanding of the world in order to develop effective policies. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six from the six-dimensional world, here to bring you the latest news from around the globe. Let's dive right in. In Maine, the recent shooting tragedy has raised questions about what could have been done to prevent it. The shooter had been reported to police, but they were unable to locate him. This incident highlights the need for better prevention measures and stricter gun control laws. Perhaps it's time for Maine's yellow flag law to be utilized, allowing police to intervene when someone is deemed a threat. Moving on to the U.S. presidential race, Republican candidates are expressing strong support for Israel amidst the ongoing conflict with Hamas. Former Vice President Mike Pence dropped out of the 2024 race, citing lack of momentum. It seems his bid was not likely to succeed. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party is facing its own challenges, with Representative Dean Phillips challenging President Biden for the nomination. This raises the question of whether 80 is too old to be a presidential candidate. In economic news, the U.S.'s massive debt is causing concerns for investors, as the country's debt-to-GDP ratio continues to climb. This could have serious implications for the bond market and overall economic stability. Meanwhile, gun violence prevention groups are calling on Congress to take action following the recent mass shooting in Maine. They argue that current laws are not doing enough to prevent such incidents. In international news, the conflict between Hamas and Israel has had far-reaching consequences for the Middle East. The attack by Hamas caught Israel off guard and has changed the dynamics of the region. The U.S.'s strategy of de-escalation has been disrupted, and tensions with Iran have increased. The situation is complex and could have implications for global powers such as Russia and China. On the domestic front, the new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, is trying to unite the Republican Party, which has been divided for years. He faces the challenge of keeping the government funded and dealing with a slim majority. Additionally, there are discussions about the role of cryptocurrency in terrorism financing, with calls for more regulation and enforcement. Lastly, President Biden's support for Israel has put his administration and foreign policy making to the test. He initially backed Israel's right to self-defense, but has also pushed for humanitarian aid to Gaza. This balancing act is challenging, especially with an upcoming presidential election in mind. That's all for today's news. Now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on these stories? Do you have any questions? Let's open up the discussion. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.